You used to be a wrestler, didn't you? Is that right?
I still am.
Oh, yeah.
I'm feared in every girls' school in this country.
Hello and welcome to Criminal History. Jimmy Savile was such a ridiculously monstrous character that he outdoes even the most excessively exaggerated evil movie villain. He was such a bizarre looking and acting character, and his crimes were so heinous that if he appeared as a character in a book, movie or computer game, the believability factor would be near zero. The romantic poet Lord Byron once expressed that truth is stranger than fiction, and in the case of Jimmy Savile, this is grimly correct. Even creative horror geniuses like Stephen King could not conjure up a figure so grotesquely evil, nefariously cunning and strange. The sane human mind cannot grasp the murky depths of depravity and cruelty some people are capable of. Savile, who was buried in a golden coffin as a hero whilst live cameras rolled, escaped all punishment for his wicked crimes. However, victims enraged by this grandiose display would soon crack through the dam of secrecy that had protected this beastly man. This, coupled with the UK law stating one cannot defame the dead, burst through and unleashed a tsunami of wicked crimes. This also highlighted the failings of the establishment, which has irreparably damaged the public perception of powerful people and institutions. Savile was born during the Great Depression in Leeds, England, 1926. His early career as a coal miner during World War II did little to predict his rise to fame and posthumous infamy. He started his rise as a DJ in dance halls in England. Savile claimed he was the first DJ to use 2 turntables and a microphone. Many publications substantiate these claims, stating that in 1943 he held the first ever DJ dance party. He later admitted that part of the reason he became a DJ was easy access to girls. He also competed as a semi-pro cyclist and professional wrestler in the early 50s. Perhaps it was his professional wrestling that helped the DJ hone his eccentric personality. Much like pro wrestlers, he would put on ostentatious displays wherever he went to garner attention and fame. He wore gaudy outfits and groomed his trademark long, silky and feminine blonde hair. Like a true narcissist, he purposefully turned heads wherever he went, not caring if the attention was good or bad. For the few that do not know what he looked like, his presentation was similar to Willy Wonka in the 1971 film, a Wonka that wore flashy gold jewellery and smoked ludicrously large cigars. He managed and DJ'd in many dance halls in the 50s and 60s, including areas such as Salford, Manchester, Leeds and Essex. And it was early on, even before he worked as a radio DJ, that concerns emerged about him. In 1958, the first police investigation was launched against the soon-to-be celebrity DJ because of child sexual abuse allegations. Some sources, such as The Guardian, claim the first incident on record happened in 1955 in a dance hall in Manchester that Savile was managing. His empire of evil could have been nipped in the bud at this time, but insufficient evidence meant that charges were dropped. His bodyguard later claimed that Savile had paid off the victims' families. Also, at this time, there was not the same awareness of perverts, especially those that targeted children, as there is now. For many, the concept of a paedophile was so horrifyingly bizarre that it was hard to believe. The term for such an offender was rarely used outside of medical records until the 80s. Whilst managing nightclubs, his violent tendencies also became glaringly evident. He would hire wrestling colleagues as bouncers, and anybody that caused trouble in his clubs would be severely dealt with. Often they were taken into the basement, tied to a chair and beaten mercilessly. For those outside of the UK, it's hard to grasp the fame he achieved over his 60 plus years as an entertainer. He reached multiple generations and became part of the UK's cultural fabric. His eccentricity helped him become one of the most iconic figures year after year. However, when his crimes emerged, his new legacy as the UK's most prolific sex offender completely tarnished his reputation and the memories of countless Brits. His eccentric look and character were more than just a way to garner attention. It was also a disguise and a way to get away with questionable behaviour in plain sight. People would dismiss him as a harmless weirdo, even when he crossed social boundaries and acted inappropriately, even on camera. He even said his silken hair was both a gimmick and a smokescreen. In 1964, Savile was asked to present and launch one of the most culturally important shows in British history, Top of the Pops, as this allowed him to mingle with some of the greatest musicians of all time. This gave him a tremendous amount of power and influence. It was during this time that many of his crimes were committed. He would take girls who were audience members back to his BBC dressing room and have his way with them. There, he honed his networking skills that would later give him access and power in the highest levels of the British establishment. He was relentless in keeping himself in the spotlight, hosting events, presenting on the radio, and raising millions for charity. But the real reason for his relentlessness and his seemingly endless supply of energy was his grotesque desires. He would fundraise for charity by running marathons. This would put into the minds of the public that he was a selfless and kind individual. This was a tactic that serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy would use to deflect from their crimes. Jimmy Savile would use his charity work to gain access to hospitals, care homes, and approved schools for emotionally disturbed teenagers. He would use this access to abuse vulnerable children and patients. His victim age range was between 5 and 75. The influence he had allowed him unlimited access to many institutions without the normal vetting procedures. He was even able to gain access to paralysed patients after he led a fundraiser to rebuild the National Spinal Injuries Centre. The charity work also elevated Jimmy's social standing in society. He was respected by the ruling establishment and developed a relationship with powerful figures including Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. His ability to raise funds for hospitals took the strain off the NHS and the UK's tax budget. Margaret Thatcher even pushed to have Jimmy Savile knighted on several occasions in the early 80s. Thatcher, as it turns out, had several disturbing links to the kind of crimes he was involved in. Savile was eventually knighted in 1990, the last year of Thatcher's reign as PM. Not content with infiltrating the government, Savile also wormed his way into the inner circle of the royal family. He developed a strange friendship with Prince Charles, who would later become King of the UK. In hindsight, the actions of Prince Andrew would leave people questioning the specifics of this relationship. Jimmy would be Charles's link to the working class and would write to him for advice about how to reach and appeal to this demographic. Savile also met with the Pope when he visited the UK, so make of that as you will. Even more unsavoury characters, including the disgraced Rolf Harris and Gary Glitter, were friends with him. He also gained access to many children when he worked as a presenter for the TV show Jim Will Fix It. This show, which was watched by around 20 million people, granted the wishes of children who would write into the show. However, this almost presented Savile with a casting couch scenario with children too young to consent to what he was proposing. Perhaps, if they complied with this powerful figure, Jimmy would make their dreams come true. Disturbingly, Savile also had open access to Britain's answer to Arkham Asylum, Broadmoor Hospital. There, he befriended some of the most insanely evil people the UK has ever produced, including Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. He even had his own suite and apartment within the building. His stature even meant that he was able to be present during strip searches and baths. The whistle was even blown about Jimmy Savile abusing patients by psychiatric nurse Naomi Stanley, but this fell on deaf ears when brought to superiors. It later transpired that he may have been the most evil man to walk the grim floors of Broadmoor. As the years went on, suspicions about Jimmy Savile grew. In all his years, he had never had a wife or even a girlfriend. Some believed he was perhaps a closeted homosexual. However, more depraved whisperings of his proclivities started to emerge. He would often brag to colleagues about his conquests, and it was well known in the industry that he liked younger women, or more accurately, young girls. Famously, provocative punk rocker Johnny Rotten tried to expose the rumours on a BBC radio interview. The interview was prevented from being released until years later, and he was blacklisted from BBC Radio.
On film, I'd like to kill Jimmy Savile. I think he's a hypocrite. I bet he's into all kinds of seediness that we all know about but are not allowed to talk about. I know some rumours.
Yeah, people always tell you things, don't they?
Ain't I a bitch, eh, don't you think?
On occasion.
I bet none of this will be allowed out.
I shouldn't imagine libelous stuff will be allowed out.
Nothing I said is liable.
Complaints were made about Jimmy's conduct to the BBC, including by a guest he was filmed groping in the audience. These complaints were shut down by the BBC. However, it was an open secret within the company that he was a pervert. Accusations and concerns were also expressed to the authorities and hospital higher-ups, but were ultimately ignored. He hid behind the tens of millions of pounds he raised for hospitals across the UK. All the while, like a wolf in sheep's clothing, he was abusing hospital patients, including in Leeds General Infirmary, where he had his own office and access to all areas. It later emerged he had abused around 60 staff and patients, including 19 children, and there were probably many more victims. During this time, working in hospitals such as Stoke Mandeville, nurses in the know would tell children to pretend to be asleep when Jimmy was around to avoid drawing his attention. Investigative journalists had also started to look into the rumours of Jimmy Savile by the 90s. Claims were made by former underaged approved schoolgirl victims that he would take them out in his Rolls Royce or van for sexual purposes. One also claimed that she was taken back to a flat close to the BBC. But Savile had an extremely powerful legal team, and the popularity of the people and the establishment behind him. This, along with the reluctance from victims to go public, meant a planned expose was pulled from production to avoid defamation lawsuits. Police also began to receive anonymous reports about his proclivities. However, it was later shown that Savile had a mysteriously close relationship with members of the police force in West Yorkshire. He even met them and other influential figures in the community each Friday for friendly meetings known as the Friday Morning Club. This was the same police force that received the anonymous letter alleging Savile was a paedophile. Suspiciously, the allegation went no further. It seemed like the police had numerous reasons to look into him thoroughly. In 2007, police were again contacted by a woman who had witnessed his abuse at Duncroft Girls' School 30 years prior. This led to a further 3 women making allegations, and he was questioned under caution in 2009. He rejected all allegations, claiming the girls were conspiring against him to get money out of him.
I'll say everything. I've had so much of this in 50 years, you know. It's always either someone looking for a few quid or a story for the paper.
What we'll do, Jimmy, I'm not being rude stopping you there. I will give you a chance to say, but it's just important that I get this introduction bit done.
You didn't interrupt me.
Did you specifically go to Duncroft knowing it was an all-girls place to receive sexual gratification?
That is a complete flight of fantasy.
She said that when you visited Duncroft, she showed you across to a place called Norman Lodge.
No, I can't remember that.
Did you ask her to give you what she calls a blue job?
Out of the question.
So did you ask for a massage from the girls when you visited Duncroft?
Not at all. Never.
Did you ask them to comb your hair at all?
No.
Why would these girls say this about you?
We always get something like this coming around at Christmas because we all want a few quid at Christmas, right? Normally you can just brush them away like midges. They will try blackmail. If you don't send us money, I will say that you've done this and you've done that.
Meanwhile, Friends Reunited became a platform for former victims to share stories. And finally, when he died, those victims began to speak out as they were utterly sickened by his lavish televised funeral and the endless tributes. The first to come forward claimed that when she was underage, Savile asked for and received sexual favours, and in return he would bring her onto his TV show Clunk Clink. Editors repeatedly shut down and suppressed the story until 10 months after his death, when it became too much to silence. Journalists working on the story were told to stop doing so immediately by higher-ups. A former BBC reporter had to leave the BBC to go to a rival station to release the information. The BBC had been trying to stop the release of the story, as Jimmy Savile had been one of their biggest stars, and many of the crimes were perpetrated on BBC premises. They were happy to bury the crimes against children to protect their own reputation. Instead, they carried on with their tribute programming whilst knowing about his crimes.
Media organizations, it turns out, aren't very good at investigating themselves. A revolting sexual abuse scandal at the BBC just keeps on getting worse and is now echoing all the way to New York. Jimmy Savile was an incredibly popular BBC personality. Now there are accusations that he abused more than 200 boys and girls before his death last year. The BBC program Newsnight, to its credit, started looking into the allegations and even interviewed at least one alleged victim, but the program's editor killed that investigation last year. What I would call a cover-up if it were done by the government.
More and more crimes began to emerge as time went on. He literally emerged as a monster beyond anyone's comprehension. He did not only target young girls as first suspected, but boys also. It also was not only children he targeted. In fact, the age range of victims was from 5 to 75 years old. He even targeted brain-damaged and paralysed patients who were utterly defenceless of his evil ways. Over 400 people came forward to talk about the crimes Jimmy Savile had committed against them. A small scope of the actual number. He was even exposed by his own nephew for bringing him and other children to sex parties with wealthy elites. This goes some way to prove the theory that Savile was a procurer of children to wealthy elites, and that's why he had so much protection from his crimes. And after the revelations of Jeffrey Epstein, this is a much more plausible theory. His nephew, Guy Marsden, reported these parties to the police, but no action was taken. After his death, all his accolades were rightly removed. However, it is deeply infuriating that he slipped off to death without punishment. Since the revelations, many have called to have the BBC licence fee cancelled as they were complicit in covering up the crimes. One good thing to come from the revelations was that police investigations into other TV stars and politicians were launched, and many were finally punished for sex crimes. However, the sheer number of people charged was a shocking reflection of people in power positions in the UK and how they use these positions to abuse children. It has also changed the way sex crimes are treated. Victims are more likely to be believed and action is quicker to be taken by authorities.